Today is the second day I make my program in Germany. I apologize, by the way, for the slightly dark picture. This is the best I can do here, and I hope you can all see and hear me clearly enough. And as I've discussed, this is going to probably be a shorter video than the usual because of the time constraints that I am under. Well, let's begin, let's go straight in. And the first thing to say is that the most important news, not just in terms of the conflict in Ukraine or in terms of the political crisis or political conflicts in the United States, but in terms of the global situation, was the presidential debate that took place yesterday. I say that because whatever one's feelings about the United States, it remains the case that it is the dominant country still in world affairs. Its position may be receding, but it still remains the place which, if you like, makes the weather in terms of international affairs. And by the way, that also includes economic affairs also. Well, I'm not going to unpick what happened over the course of the debate yesterday. All I will do is read a quick set of headlines from the British newspapers today. So we start with The Guardian. Calls for Biden to stand aside grow after shaky debate performance against Trump. Then the Daily Telegraph. Biden under pressure to quit after painful debate performance. The Financial Times. Democrats panic as Biden stumbles in bad-tempered debate with Trump. The London Times. Trump-Biden debate. Democrats panic as president stumbles. And lastly, the BBC. Biden's incoherent debate performance heightens fears over his age. So that's what the British media is saying. And I would say that the British media has tended to be strongly sympathetic to the president and deeply hostile to his opponent. In the case of Anthony Zurcher, who wrote that article in the BBC, he was, suffice to say, one of the ardent supporters of the theory that the president's challenger, Donald Trump, had received assistance from the Russians during the 2016 election. So there we are. That's the media in Britain today. I'm going to express quickly my own view, which is this. Way back in the autumn, my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, stated in a program which we did on the Duran that if the Democrats were indeed thinking that the president's age and other issues were an obstacle to his re-election, then the time to arrange for him to step aside was coming up quickly. We're talking about the autumn of 2023 now. It needed to be done before the primary season got underway, and leaving it too late would create all kinds of further problems. And I'm afraid it seems to me that is exactly what has happened. It's all very well talking about the president stepping aside, standing down, somebody else taking his place. But we're now at the very end of June. The primary season is well behind us. In the primaries, the president received an overwhelming mandate from the electors, going into a convention with the question of who will be the candidate of the Democratic Party open for the presidency in the election in November. Well, that seems to me to invite all kinds of problems, and would do so even if the Democratic Party were fully united, which, as we know, it is not. So it is very, very late in the day to be thinking of this, And that, of course, doesn't even take into account the president's own feelings and those of his immediate family. Now, I'm not going to say more about this because, as I said, we've only got a limited amount of time, but I would just add one further thing. I listened very carefully to what Donald Trump had to say about the Ukraine war. He made it, I think, fairly clear that he doesn't think much of the Ukraine war. In other words, he doesn't feel comfortable with it at all. He would rather see it ended as quickly as possible. I don't think we got much insight as to what he would do if he is elected president of the United States in November, which is, by the way, still far from being a done thing. And I'm not sure that President Trump himself really knows how he's going to end the war either. He seems to acknowledge, at least, that Ukraine is suffering terrible casualties and that it is losing the war, but he still spoke about President Putin's proposals of 2 weeks ago as unacceptable. Anyway, let's move on. Let's move on to other topics, and let's come to the situation on the Ukrainian battlefields, where events are moving very quickly and where all sorts of things are taking place. Now, the first thing to say is that this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry published this statement. The Russian Defense Ministry noted the increased intensity of US strategic unmanned aerial vehicles over the Black Sea waters, which are conducting reconnaissance and targeting high-precision weapons supplied to the armed forces of Ukraine by Western states to launch strikes at Russian facilities. This demonstrates the increasing involvement of the United States and NATO countries in the Ukrainian conflict on the side of the Kiev regime. Such flights increase the possibility of air incidents involving Russian aerospace forces aircraft, increasing the risk of a direct confrontation between the alliance, that's to say NATO, and the Russian Federation. The NATO countries will be responsible for this. The Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Andrei Belousov, has instructed the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces to make proposals on measures for rapid response to provocation. Now, some are taking this as an indication that the Russians have now decided to shoot down American and NATO drones. That's not exactly what this statement says, but we are now coming very close to that point. But yesterday, before this announcement appeared, there were reports that the United States and the other NATO countries, becoming increasingly concerned that the Russians might start to shoot down US and NATO drones over the Black Sea, have started air patrols over the Black Sea with fighter jets. And it seems to me that this comment, this statement from the Russian Defense Ministry is preparing the ground for a possible clash between Russian aircraft and NATO aircraft over the Black Sea. It is another terrifying development, one which I never expected to see once, but here we are. We now have a situation where the Russians, who have, by the way, undoubtedly a superiority in aircraft over the Black Sea, are now talking about possibly getting involved in armed confrontations with Western aircraft over the Black Sea. And Belousov has given instructions to the Russian military's general staff to come up with a plan to respond to this development, which means that it's likely we're going to see more Russian air defense assets deployed to the Black Sea area. There are already rumors that the Russians have deployed an S-500 air defense missile system to Crimea. But these rumors, and I call them rumors, originated with a claim by Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, and given its provenance, I don't take that report as being especially reliable. But it could be that over the next few days or weeks, Russian air defense systems will be reinforced in the Black Sea area, perhaps with S-500 missiles. It could be that more Russian fighter jets, possibly Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighters, of which Russia is now believed to have between 30 and 40, just saying, well, they could be deployed to the Black Sea area as well. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Suffice to say that the Russians have given ample warnings of counter-escalations, and we remember that just a few days ago, the Russians called in the American ambassador to the foreign ministry and warned her that following the ATACMS strike on the Crimean beach, there would be Russian retaliation against the United States, which was seen by the Russians as complicit in that attack. And of course, there then followed almost immediately a telephone call to the Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov by Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary. It appears to have been an attempt to try to calm the Russians. The Russians, as I said in my program yesterday, it would cut no ice with them. And we see today that they're starting to take retaliatory measures, this time against NATO drones and possibly manned aircraft over the Black Sea. And, well, we will see what happens. It could be that the situation is going to start to become very dangerous indeed. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this incident for the moment. It certainly bears watching. The Russians are still considering their response, but I suspect that the days of unchallenged activities by Western drones over the Black Sea are going to fade away. What else happens over the next few months, weeks, days, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, since we're talking about air defense matters, the United States, having already told its European allies that it's not prepared to provide them with any more Patriot air defense interceptors, because all spare Patriot air defense missile interceptors are going to be sent to Ukraine, are now, according to the Financial Times, arms twisting the Israelis to give Ukraine all of the Patriot missile batteries that Israel possesses, which is said to number eight Israeli Patriot missile batteries supposedly to be transferred to Ukraine. Now, I think that at this particular time, this demand will be deeply unwelcome in Israel, and for two reasons. Firstly, Israel is now potentially in a confrontation situation, both with Iran and with Iran's ally Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is said to have 100,000 missiles, and Iran has demonstrated that it can launch missiles against Israel as well, some of these being apparently very fast, maybe even hypersonic missiles, very difficult for Israel to intercept. So Israel does not want to denude its air defenses in the face of this kind of threat. But I think that there will be another reason why the Israelis will not take well to this demand. And I suspect it is not a request. I suspect it is a demand. Because what this demand is telling the Israelis is that the United States, despite telling Israel that it has its back in the event that there is a confrontation with Hezbollah, nonetheless prioritizes aid for Ukraine over aid for Israel. That is not a situation that the Israelis have ever found themselves in before, and they won't like it, and they will push back against it, and they will be complaining, even as I'm making this program. I say this with absolute confidence. They will be complaining to their friends in Washington that this is happening. Now, since we are on the topic of air defense systems, the Russian Defense Ministry again yesterday claimed that it had shot down 4 Patriot air defense missiles after launch. Now, when I discussed this before, when the Russian Defense Ministry made that claim before, I said that this was a most interesting development, and I speculated that it must be happening in Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainians are trying to establish air defense positions in the face of the battle in Kharkiv with group of forces north. But there was inevitably some pushback, and people said that probably what had happened is that the Russian Defense Ministry had made a mistake, and when they were talking about Patriot air defense missiles being shot down, what they really meant was ATACMS missiles being shot down. Well, we've seen that for a second day now, the Russian Defense Ministry is talking about the fact that it is shooting down Patriot missiles. So I think that makes it conclusive. Ukraine has deployed Patriot air defense missile batteries close to the line of contact in Kharkiv region. They're trying to shoot down Russian Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, dropping heavy Fab bombs, including Fab 3000 bombs, on the Ukrainian military. They're trying to support the Ukrainian Air Force, which is itself trying to conduct some kind of air sorties over the Kharkiv area. A MiG-29 was shown flying over Kharkiv, dropping French guided bombs on Russian positions. In the very same report where the Russians say that they've shot down 4 Patriot air defense missiles, they also claim that they've shot down 2 MiG-29 fighters. I suspect, as I said, that all of this is going on over Kharkiv region, and assuming that the Russian claims are true, and on these matters, I tend to think that the Russian claims are true, then the Russians have developed a capability of shooting down Patriot air defense missiles after launch. And that is, I think, a very important military development indeed. It further calls into question the viability of the Patriot air defense system operating on the contact line in Ukraine. Again, let me stress, if this report is actually true. And wrapping up all of these pieces of information about air defense systems and missile systems and shooting down of drones and that kind of thing. Last night, the Russians also carried out a massive missile and drone campaign against Ukrainian airfields, and it seems that 3 airfields were targeted. These were Starokonstantinov in the central western areas of Ukraine. This is expected to be the airfield from which the F-16s will operate. It has been repeatedly attacked by the Russians and repeatedly damaged by the Russians, and last night they attacked it again. And the Russians also attacked 2 other airfields in Ukraine. One was at Poltava, which is a city some distance west of Kharkiv, but probably an airfield, the airfield from which the MiG-29s have been taking off, which have been attempting to carry out airstrikes on Russian positions in Kharkiv region. And the other airfield was apparently one in Mirgorod, which, if it is Mirgorod, if that refers to Mirgorod, which is a place near Pokrovsk, that is, of course, also located in Donbass, and probably that is also a place where MiG-29s are taking off in order to conduct airstrikes on Russian positions along the contact line. So there we go. This is Russians launching massive missile strikes against Ukrainian positions. And last night, the Russians confirmed that some of these airstrikes, allegedly 5 of the missiles that were used, were Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, presumably principally targeting the airfields. Now, the Ukrainians, for their part, as always, admit that they didn't shoot down any of the Kinzhal missiles, but they claim that they shot down all of the other missiles, subsonic cruise missiles, Calibre missiles, and KH-109 and KH-59 missiles that the Russians launched, as well as all the Duran drones. Whether they did, I have absolutely no idea, but I am deeply skeptical. They've made similar claims in the past, and the evidence on the contrary has tended to show that at least a proportion of the Russian missiles that the Ukrainians claim to have shot down did in fact hit their targets. Anyway, that's the situation in terms of the air war. Let's now turn to the actual situation on the front lines. And here, I'm afraid, again, more news from the battlefronts, and it looks like there's been an acceleration in tempo by the Russians, and the reports speak of the Russians advancing further and faster all across the front lines. Now, yesterday, I spoke of reports from Group of Forces North, which on the face of it appeared to suggest that they had captured the area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk, the so-called citadel area in Volchansk. Now, again, I have to stress, I'm not sure that this is necessarily the case, but others have now picked up on that report. And whilst most seem to accept that there is at least some fighting still ongoing in the area of the high-rise buildings, the Russians have now launched a concerted attack on this area in Volchansk, and this territory, if it hasn't yet fallen, is about to do so. Well, if that is correct, then it's a decisive defeat for the Ukrainians in northern Volchansk, the area of the Volcha River, north of the Volcha River. I believe this makes up the greater part of Volchansk. I'm going to guess that the Russians have more opportunities to cross the Volcha River southwards than the Ukrainians have to cross the Volcha River northwards. But more likely than not, what will happen if the Russians do capture the high-rise building area over the next couple of days is that they will spend some weeks probably clearing northern Volchansk and taking steps to stabilize their positions in the Kharkiv region prior to any further decisions to launch more offensives in the Kharkiv region in midsummer, or perhaps later in the summer, or perhaps in the early autumn. I doubt that the Russians intend at the moment to press forward beyond northern Volchansk. They've still got a lot of clearing to do in Volchansk itself. And elsewhere, there's been no news of any Ukrainian attacks in Lipsy. Thus looks as if those attempts to attack in Lipsy have failed. And there are reports today, early this morning, that the Russians have now crossed the border elsewhere in Kharkiv region and have either occupied another village or are attempting to do so. Still not clear, by the way, whether they still occupy that village in Sumy region that they claimed to have occupied some weeks ago. I've no idea what has happened there. Perhaps the Ukrainians have reoccupied it, who knows. But anyway, it serves as a further example of what I said in my video yesterday, that the Russians can attack whenever and wherever they choose. They hold the strategic initiative over the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are being pushed to move reserves from one place on the front lines to another because they're short of men, trained manpower, and they're short of equipment, and they're short of pretty much everything. And on the topic of trained manpower, there's been much commentary recently about how the Ukrainian military has become diluted with untrained reservists who do not share the enthusiasm and determination of the veteran fighters who were overwhelmingly supporters of the Maidan movement and who enrolled in the Ukrainian army in the first weeks of the war in large numbers. They still exist, there's still some of them, but increasingly the Ukrainians, having to extend their mobilization, are calling up people who do not want to fight. And according to Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's now disillusioned and embittered former spin doctor, who I believe has now relocated to New York in the United States, according to him, 6 battalions of the Ukrainian army have, at various points of the line of contact, over the course of the last couple of days, straightforwardly refused orders to attack. I can't verify this information. I'm not sure that Arestovich has ever been a particularly reliable source. That was true when he was Zelensky's spin doctor, and it is equally true, or so it seems to me today. But against that, one has to say that there are complaints from veteran units of the Ukrainian army that these reservists who've been called up are unreliable. The Russians, over the course of the last 24 hours, conducted a major missile strike on a Ukrainian position in Kurachovo. The 76th Brigade is apparently grumbling that this was one of their major logistical and bases in Kurachovo, and they're complaining that the Russians worked out its location because this information was given to them by reservists, former Ukrainian reservists, who had surrendered and who had shared with the Russians all the information which they had. Now, of course, we mustn't assume that that claim from the 72nd Brigade is true. I mean, it could just be angry and embittered comments. It's a pretty angry and embittered brigade altogether. As I said, we mustn't assume that this report is actually true. It could be that the Russians found out where this place was located through some other means, but it does show how bad the relationship between the Ukrainian veterans and the reservists has become, the degree of distrust and animus that apparently exists. And this is just one report. Apparently there was another report about Ukrainian reservists being sent to fight in Krasnogorovka, and that their eyes had to be shut and things like that, which of course means that they were not shown the important and sensitive information or deployment details and things of that kind, because they weren't trusted to provide that weren't trusted not to provide that information to the Russians in the event that they were captured. So it looks as if there's dissension increasing in the Ukrainian army. And of course, the fact that there have been arguments between military units and also criticism of the high command by the Azov brigade, leading to the dismissal of General Sordol. All of that perhaps gives us increasing indications that things for the Ukrainian military internally are not well. Anyway, moving along the various places on the battlefronts, there seems to be now universal acknowledgement that the Russians have indeed captured the village of Rozdolovka in the Siversk area, that they are gaining more ground in the Kupiansk area, that there's still very fierce fighting in Chasiv Yar, but statements from Ukrainian soldiers talk about a desperate situation there. And there's been more concern, apparently, about what's going on in the Toretsk area, where the Russians began their unexpected attack about a week ago. And we've got a comment about this time from a Russian official, Igor Kimarkovsky, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, the head of the Russian appointed or elected government of the Donetsk People's Republic. And Kimarkovsky says, Toretsk is another area where the Ukrainian army is not in the best situation. Pressure from our forces has made them withdraw from a number of highly important positions in this sector of the front line. And Kimarkovsky is then reported by TASS as saying that the Ukrainian armed forces have lost dozens of troops in the Toretsk area in recent days. So there we are. That's what Kimarkovsky tells us about the situation in Toretsk. And in fact, supplementing that, there's a report that the Russians have now broken into the village of New York, which is not a place in the United States, but a village which perhaps ought to be understood best as a suburb of Toretsk. The Russians have supposedly broken into this place, and there's fighting now going on, allegedly, in the central areas of New York. Well, who knows? We'll no doubt find out more as time proceeds, but Kimarkovsky, at least, appears to be confident from the Russian side that they are indeed making progress in the fighting in this area. So elsewhere, in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area, intense fighting is continuing for the remaining villages that the Russians need to capture west of Ocheretino in order to strengthen their flanks before they commit fully to their attack on the village of Vozdvizhenka and cut the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians seem to understand how important this battle is, because they're apparently putting up an determined resistance, trying to hold the Russians back at the village of Sokol. According to the military summary channel, the Russians have made the most of Ukrainian resistance in this area, and that they have destroyed hundreds of Ukrainian armored vehicles precisely in this area where the Ukrainians are defending. Now, in its, I think, either latest or penultimate report, the military summary channel made a really astonishing claim, and I don't know whether it's true, but they said that the Ukrainians might have lost more armored vehicles in this area of Sokol and the other village of Novosilovka Persha, which are also being fought over, that the Ukrainians might have lost more armoured vehicles in this area, including Western armoured vehicles, in fact, primarily Western armoured vehicles, than they were lost this time last year during Ukraine's great offensive in Zaporozhye in the Rabotino area. Now, I have to say, I find that astonishing. I'm not sure that I quite believe this claim. It seems incredible, but it does seem as if a very large number of machines, Ukrainian machines, are being destroyed, based at least on film and pictures. Though perhaps it's important to say that the mere fact that a vehicle is hit by an FPV drone, a Russian FPV drone, doesn't mean that it is no longer that it has to be completely written off. If it can be retrieved and sent back to be repaired, then it might be saved. Anyway, what is true is that apparently in this general area, and I'm not going to say exactly when, a group of Russian soldiers came across a abandoned M1 Abrams tank that the Ukrainians had just left behind on the battlefronts. From what I could see, and I'm not particularly good at understanding pictures, but from what I could see, this vehicle, this tank, seemed to have suffered only superficial damage. The United States some weeks ago, at least the US media some weeks ago, was reporting that the Ukrainians had withdrawn all the Abrams tanks that they had from the battlefronts to the rear because of the very high losses that these tanks were suffering. Shortly after, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is the brigade that operates these tanks, issued a statement saying that this was absolutely not the case. If they were to give up, if they were to send all their best tanks into the rear, they would have no more tanks left. And in fact, as we have seen, the Abrams tanks continue to operate on the battlefronts, though with no apparent success. And this will have been the second one of these tanks to have been captured almost intact by the Russians. Just saying. So, a lot of this happening. Since I'm talking about on the subject of tanks, by the way, it looks as if there is some kind of a tank build-up underway in Ukraine, but this appears to center most on Leopard 1 tanks designed in the 1950s, principally deployed by the Bundeswehr, the West German army, in the 1960s, gradually replaced by the Leopard 2 in the 1980s. Apparently, some of these tanks have been converted into anti-aircraft vehicles with high rapid caliber machine guns or cannon. But it looks as if before very long, it'll be the Leopard 1 which will take the place of the T-64s and the T-72s and the Leopard 2s and the Abrams as the main tank, the main battle tank of the Ukrainian army. And, well, it's not without its strength. It's got apparently very good optics. And it's apparently agile and fast on the battlefronts. But it is very lightly armoured. And its gun is not up to the quality, the power of more modern tank guns. And certainly it is not up to the power of the very powerful 125mm guns that the Russian tanks have. And as for agility and speed over the battlefronts, well, I suspect that the T-80 tank with its gas turbine engine that the Russians are now busy modernizing and churning out in ever larger numbers, and which is also starting to appear in very, very significant quantities on the battlefronts, that it too probably is superior in speed and agility, though not in range, to the Leopard 1. Just saying. So anyway, a very bad situation in Toretsk, a very bad situation in places like Sokol, where the Ukrainians are taking terrible losses, and more reports of the Ukrainians now gradually pulling out of Krasnogorovka. It's difficult to be sure exactly what is taking place, but it seems that the Ukrainians are evacuating the main fortified positions that they have in Krasnogorovka, and that they're slowly pulling their forces out towards the west. Now, the Ukrainians apparently themselves are saying that they've been obliged to do that because so many of the troops they have in reserve, the best troops that they have in reserve, have all had to be redeployed to the north, to the Kharkiv front, leaving them short of men and machines in this area, in Krasnogorovka, so that it looks as if that this town finally is about to fall. I suspect that the Russians have known for some time that the Ukrainians intended to evacuate from Krasnogorovka, and that this perhaps explains why the Russians didn't press home their attacks in Krasnogorovka very aggressively after the central areas of the town were captured. Just saying. So there's also been news from the Vremivka salient. Russians apparently launched a big attack to capture the village of Urozhaine. They've already recaptured Staromayorsk. This is all being connected to the fight for Vuhledar. Of course, if Krasnogorovka is captured, if the Russians do succeed in cutting the main road from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar, and the Russian Defense Ministry has published a film of Russian troops getting very close to this road. According to some reports, they're only half a kilometer away from it. Well, if all this happens, then it seems to me that the days of Vuhledar are now numbered. Well, that's my quick overview of the situation on the battlefronts. Bad news for the Ukrainians right across them. Situation in Kharkiv is bad. Situation in Siversk is deteriorating. Chasiv Yar, Ukrainians just holding on. Toretsk, Ukrainians being pushed back. Perhaps fighting now underway in New York. Ukrainians holding on just in places like Sokol and Novoselivka, Persia, but at the cost of tremendous losses, evacuating apparently Krasnogorovka and witnessing perhaps the last days, the start of the beginning of the end of the position in Vuhledar. Now this might explain a sudden shift in tone from Zelensky himself. Yesterday he came out and said that Ukraine did not want to see the war prolonged indefinitely, that Ukraine's losses were too high to make that acceptable, and that at some point over the next few months they would have to consider what sort of position to take with respect to negotiations. Now, those words of Zelensky were made before the presidential debate in the United States, from which, as I said, it's become absolutely clear that Donald Trump is uncomfortable about the war. Donald Trump has also made some very uncomplimentary comments about Zelensky himself. I'm not going to repeat them. But suffice to say, he doesn't seem to be impressed with Zelensky at all. I wouldn't be surprised if at some level he blames Zelensky for the first impeachment that he experienced as president, which derived from a telephone conversation that President Trump had with Zelensky. Not going to discuss that in more detail here. But anyway, even before this television debate, with perhaps the president already behind in some opinion polls, it looks as if Zelensky, seeing the failure of his peace summit, which wasn't, of course, a peace summit in Switzerland. By the way, it appears that the Patriarch of Constantinople has withdrawn his signature from the final communique. I owe that information to the American diplomat, former diplomat, Jim Jatras, just saying. But anyway, after the failure of the peace summit, with the losses mounting, with perhaps concerns about the outcome of the election in the United States, Zelensky is now finally talking negotiations. Well, it's very late in the day. Perhaps one could argue better later than never. Ukraine does still have some cards left to play. The war isn't yet done. But I think President Zelensky needs to understand two things. The first is that as far as the Russians are concerned, he is no longer a suitable person to negotiate with. And though they were prepared to negotiate with him in the spring of 2022, they have said that they are not prepared to negotiate with him now. And I agree with them. I think that is probably the position that they're going to stick with. That's the first thing. The second is that I think it is all but inconceivable that the Ukrainians will be able to stop the Russians and agree to get the Russians to agree to a freeze on the current line of contact. In my previous program, I've spent some time discussing the Kellogg plan that has been presented to President Trump. It seems as if it is not President Trump's plan. It seems that it's not even clear so far that President Trump approves of this plan in any form. The freeze idea, if that is what Zelensky is coming to, was never a viable plan. It needs to be forgotten and dropped, and substantive negotiations need to begin. But the big news from the war today remains for me that statement from the Russians, that they are becoming increasingly exasperated by the US drone activities over the Black Sea, US and NATO drone activities over the Black Sea, that the General Staff has been ordered by the new Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov, to come up with a plan to deal with this problem. And at a time when there are reports of NATO fighter jets flying over the Black Sea, given this Russian statement, the risks of a direct clash between the Russian Air Force and NATO, as the Russians themselves say, have now increased to dangerous levels. All of this is happening in the absence of negotiations. Perhaps if there is an armed clash between the Russian and NATO air forces, that will finally be the event that galvanizes moves towards negotiations, especially if NATO aircraft are shot down, and heavens help us if NATO pilots are captured, just saying. But one way or the other, the situation over the Black Sea has become extremely dangerous. And I will quickly finish by saying that I think that the British, who have been so aggressive in egging the Ukrainians on to take action over the Black Sea, must share a certain degree of responsibility for this. Well, this is where I end my program today. As I said, I have to do shorter programs for the moment. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget that you can check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing things, including our continuing Football 24 series. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.